Hello there and welcome. Tonight, we'll take a quiet journey into the past to explore a story not often told out loud, but deeply important. It is the story of the Netherlands, of natural gas, of quiet wealth, and of the slow, invisible changes that shaped a nation. This is the story of what came to be called the Dutch disease, not a sickness of the body, but of the economy and of the balance that can be lost when fortune comes too fast. But do not worry, this is not a tale of crisis or chaos. It is a gentle story told slowly with care in soft and easy language. A story for learning, for drifting, for letting go. So wherever you are, in bed, on the couch, or just needing a moment of peace, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day fade. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw loosen, and your eyes grow heavy. Before we begin, please consider doing something small to support this peaceful space. Tap the like button if you enjoy calm history told with care. Click subscribe if you'd like more journeys like this one. And if you feel like it, leave a quiet message in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from. Or just say hello. Now, close your eyes if you like. Get comfortable and join me as we begin the journey. Part 1. A land of wind and water. Before there were pipelines, before there were policies and price shifts and energy booms, there was quiet. A land of wind and water. That is what the Netherlands had always been. Flat fields stretched wide across the northern coast, where the horizon seemed to blend with the sky. Ditches traced slow lines between the land, draining the soil so it could be farmed. Narrow canals moved like gentle veins, carrying boats and barges between villages, towns, and ports. In many places, the sea had once claimed the land, but now the land was held firm by walls of stone and sand and willpower. The Dutch were not loud about their success. They did not boast of power or chase glory. But in their way, they had mastered the elements. Windmills turned with grace above green meadows, harnessing the breeze to move water, grind grain, or shape wood. Some were old, wooden frames creaking slowly, their sails patched and worn. Others were newer, taller, stronger. But all had the same purpose, to work with the wind instead of fighting it. They had become part of the land's rhythm. The people were steady, too. Life was not rushed here. In the cities, there were streetcars, coffee houses, bookstores, and merchants. Along the docks, men in wool coats loaded cargo into ships that creaked against the tide. In the smaller towns and villages, children rode bicycles beside fields of tulips and cows. Shopkeepers opened their doors each morning with quiet routine. Bakers kneaded dough in low-lit kitchens, and farmers watched the skies for signs of rain or frost. Trade had long been the heartbeat of the Dutch economy. Goods moved in and out of the ports. Cheese, oil paints, electrical tools, steel, wool, fish, books, and clocks. The Dutch didn't just sell things. They fixed them, built them, improved them. There was skill in the factories and care in the warehouses. From Rotterdam to Eindhoven to Groningen, work was steady and thoughtful. The world respected Dutch industry. It was not flashy. It was not enormous. But it was clever, reliable, balanced. In the years after the Second World War, the Netherlands had rebuilt itself with quiet pride. There had been hardship, of course. The scars of occupation and hunger could still be felt in some corners, but the 1950s had brought healing. Infrastructure grew. Education expanded. The country leaned into peace, science, and industry. Steel mills ran with purpose. Textile shops hummed. New homes were built with brick and hope. By the late 1950s, the Dutch were not wealthy in the way of oil kingdoms or colonial empires. But they were secure. Their economy was diverse. Their labor was skilled. Their exports were trusted. Their people were modest, inventive, and close to the land. They had no great need for sudden riches. And yet, beneath the soil of the northern fields, something was waiting. Not gold, not silver, but something just as powerful in the years to come. Natural gas. It had been there for centuries, locked deep in rock, hidden far below the plowed fields of Groningen. No one had looked for it because no one thought to look. After all, the land itself had always given enough. The cows grazed, the water flowed, the wind turned the mills. Why dig beneath it? But in time, science reached further. Geologists, mapping the earth for minerals and signs, noticed something unusual, a layer in the stone that seemed to trap pressure, a whisper of methane, a breath of heat rising from the deep. It was 1959 when the gas was found. A test well drilled near the small village of Sloktoren burst with unexpected strength. The gas field beneath it was vast, far larger than anyone had guessed. It stretched for miles under the province of Groningen. Quietly, officials realized what had been uncovered. A treasure. Not a treasure of coins or crowns or ancient relics, but of energy, fuel, power for homes, factories, cities. It was, they said, one of the largest natural gas fields in the world. At first, the news spread gently. There were no headlines declaring wealth overnight. The Dutch were cautious by nature. But slowly, plans began to take shape. Maps were drawn. Pipelines proposed. The nation began to think not only of what it had found, but what it might do with it. Still, in those early days, most people carried on as before. Children biked to school. Tulip bulbs were planted in straight rows. Bread was bought fresh each morning. Men played cards in quiet cafes, and women chatted over baskets at the market stalls. The windmills turned, the canals rippled, and the clocks kept ticking. The gas was there, yes, but it had not yet changed the rhythm of the country. Not yet. This was a moment of calm before the curve began. A still point in the story. A land proud of its balance. A people rooted in steadiness. The machines were humming. The books were selling. The ports were working. And under it all, a silent sea of gas waited in the dark. In Groningen, some farmers noticed a few extra visitors. Trucks, surveyors, scientists. But no one thought much of it. After all, the land had always been watched and shaped. The fields were used to being studied, but this was different. Beneath the topsoil, beneath the clay and sand and peat, lay a force that would one day push and pull the Dutch economy in ways few could predict. For now, though, the breeze still blew through the reeds. The storks returned to their nests on church steeples. The trams rolled quietly through cobbled streets. The factory workers hung their coats on iron hooks and walked home beneath soft streetlights. And the land simply held its breath, waiting. Part 2. Buried treasure beneath Groningen. The village of Sloktoren sat quietly in the northern province of Groningen. Fields stretched in all directions, flat and open, where sheep grazed near ditches and geese flew low across the morning fog. There were barns painted in weathered red and churches with pointed spires that rose gently above the tiled roofs. Life here moved slowly, shaped by the seasons and softened by the wind. Most days began the same. Roosters called out from wooden coops. Doors creaked open to the smell of damp earth and rising dough. Men stepped into boots still dusted from yesterday. Women lit small stoves, boiling water for tea. It was a life made of patterns, of habit and care, of patience. But in the late months of 1959, something began to stir beneath that patience. It began as many things do, with a hole in the ground. Not large, not dramatic. Just a test well drilled by the Nederlandse Aardelie Maatschappij, the Dutch oil company, or NAM for short. They had been exploring for oil, not gas. Oil was what the world chased in those years. Gas was useful, but oil was what moved the machines. And yet, when the drill reached a certain depth, something shifted. The pressure rose quickly. Gas rushed up the pipe with more force than expected. It wasn't a trickle or a weak puff. It was strong, steady, and clean. The engineers looked again at their instruments. They checked the layers of rock, the readings of pressure, the samples pulled from the core. This wasn't a small pocket. It wasn't a leftover bubble. It was a field, a vast, deep reservoir of natural gas spread out across the land like a buried sea. The rock that held it, a thick sandstone layer shaped by ancient time, stretched for miles beneath Groningen. Silent, hidden, untouched. No one had known. Not the farmers whose families had lived there for generations. Not the mayors of the small towns or the priests of the village churches. Not even the geologists themselves. And now, it had been found. The news did not make headlines at first. The Dutch, practical as always, moved with care. Reports were written. Meetings were held. Quiet phone calls were made to ministries in The Hague. There was no cheering in the streets, no flags raised. But in government offices, pens scratched thoughtfully on paper. In oil company boardrooms, maps were unfolded. Plans began to form. A buried treasure had been uncovered. One that did not glitter. One that made no sound. But one that could power a nation. Soon after the discovery, teams returned to Slachterrand to begin measuring the full reach of the gas. More wells were drilled. More surveys completed. What they found confirmed their hopes. The Groningen gas field was enormous, one of the largest known in the world at that time. Estimates said it could produce gas for decades, enough to heat homes, power industry, and be exported to other countries in Europe. It was, in the quietest terms, a transformation, but not everyone saw it yet. In the village, the daily rhythms continued. Cows were milked, potatoes harvested, letters delivered on bicycles. There was talk of the gas find, of course, but it seemed distant, a matter for officials and engineers, not farmers and school teachers. And in a way that was true. The gas was buried deep, far below the roots of crops and the reach of wells. It could not be seen or touched, but it could be gathered, and once gathered, it could be sold. To do that, infrastructure would be needed. Pipelines, processing plants, compressor stations. Contracts would have to be signed, rights negotiated, taxes considered. So the government and the companies began to plan. There were discussions between Shell and Esso, the parent companies of NAM. Talks with the Dutch government followed, and eventually, agreements were reached. The gas would be developed. Revenue would be shared. The project would begin slowly, with care. In 1963, the first gas began to flow to the Dutch public. Households in cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Utrecht were connected to the new supply. Gas burners replaced coal stoves. Heating became easier, cleaner, more efficient. People welcomed the change. Soon after, pipelines extended beyond the borders. Belgium, France, West Germany, all were interested in Dutch gas. Export contracts were signed. Energy flowed across Europe, and money began to flow back into the Netherlands. By the mid-1960s, the government was earning significant revenue from the gas fields. Billions of guilders, flowing steadily, year after year. This was more than just energy. It was a turning point. The country had discovered something buried, not gold, not oil, but a source of wealth that seemed almost endless. And for a time, it felt like a gift. A reward for patience, perhaps, or a sign of quiet favor from the earth. But as the money began to pour in, the shape of the economy began to shift. It was not something anyone noticed right away. At first, the gas seemed to support everything. The government had more to spend, and services improved. Roads were repaired. Public housing expanded. Education and healthcare received new funding. Factories still ran. Shops still sold their goods. But beneath the surface, much like the gas itself, a pressure was building. As revenue from gas exports increased, the Dutch guilder began to strengthen. With more foreign money coming in, the value of the currency rose. A strong currency is often seen as a sign of national strength. It makes imports cheaper. It reflects confidence. But it also makes exports more expensive. And for a country like the Netherlands, a country built on exports, that quiet shift began to matter. Suddenly, Dutch-made products cost more on the global market. Foreign buyers hesitated. Orders slowed. Competition grew from countries with weaker currencies where goods could be made and sold for less. At first, this was just a whisper. A few factory managers noticing a dip in contracts, a slight drop in shipping volumes from the ports, a delay in investment for new equipment. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Industrial output began to fall. Textile companies reported losses. Machine manufacturers faced growing competition. Smaller firms closed their doors. The gas money kept flowing, but the factory floors began to quiet. It was not a collapse, not a crisis. It was more subtle than that. A gentle erosion, a shift in weight. The gas had brought wealth, but it had also brought imbalance. Still, in the mid-1960s, the future seemed bright. The Netherlands had found a resource that was in demand across Europe. Its government was stable. Its people were well-educated and practical. And for most, the changes felt positive. Few yet understood what was happening beneath the surface. They did not know that the term Dutch disease would one day be used by economists around the world to describe this very shift. For now, the fields of Groningen remained quiet. The cows still wandered slowly through the pastures. The canals still reflected the soft sky. Children still walked home from school past low stone walls. But trucks came more often now, and the gas continued to rise. It hissed softly from the wells, invisible, odorless, collected and compressed, then sent far away through steel veins buried under roads and rivers. It would power cities in other countries. It would heat the homes of strangers, and it would reshape the very structure of the Dutch economy. But not all at once, slowly, quietly, like a change in the wind. Part 3. The Energy Rush. In the early years of the gas discovery, there was still a feeling of curiosity. The villages of Groningen watched the survey trucks with interest. The engineers wore boots caked in clay and carried clipboards as they walked the fields. They were polite, professional, and often quiet. When asked questions, they answered simply. Yes, there was gas beneath the ground. Yes, it was valuable. Yes, it would be used. But it would take time. Time was something the Dutch understood well. Even as the wells were drilled and the pipelines laid, life in the towns moved forward in its steady way. The sound of tractors in the fields still filled the mornings. The local baker still opened his doors before the sun had risen. People still gathered near the church steps on Sundays, sharing small bits of news about family, work, and the weather. But beneath this familiar rhythm, something new was beginning to stir. Across the country, plans were unfolding. Maps were drawn in government offices. Lines traced across the paper in careful blue ink, showing where the pipelines would go, how they would bend through provinces, under rivers, and across farms. These lines were not just technical. They were promises of light, warmth, and growth. In the cities, utility companies prepared to switch households from coal to gas. Coal had long been the fuel of Dutch homes, carried in sacks, stored in basements, shoveled into furnaces. It was heavy, dirty. It left soot on the walls and in the lungs. Gas, by contrast, was clean. It flowed with no effort. It burned with a soft blue flame. It brought a sense of ease. By 1963, the first major supplies of Groningen gas were delivered to Dutch homes. People noticed the difference immediately. Stoves lit with a flick instead of a match. Water heated faster. Heaters ran without the heavy scent of coal smoke. The change was not loud, but it was felt. Kitchens grew warmer in winter. Walls stayed cleaner. Life became, in small ways, more comfortable. And so demand grew. Not just at home, but abroad. European countries, rebuilding after war and growing into the new post-war age, needed energy. West Germany, France, Belgium, all were looking for stable, affordable sources of fuel. Dutch gas, it seemed, was arriving at just the right time. So the pipeline stretched further. From Groningen, they reached into the heart of the Netherlands and beyond. Underground routes snaked beneath highways and across fields. Valve stations were built. Control rooms installed. Compressor stations stood like silent giants in the open spaces, pushing the gas along its way with a quiet hum. Each year, more gas was sold. Each year, the income grew. By the mid-1960s, the government was receiving billions of guilders from the gas trade. It became one of the most important sources of national income. This new wealth flowed into public budgets. Roads were improved. Schools received better funding. Hospitals expanded their services. Public housing projects moved forward. In cities and towns across the country, people began to feel the effects of this quiet resource beneath their feet. It did not arrive with fireworks. There was no sudden burst of fortune. Instead, the changes appeared slowly, like a steady tide. New apartment blocks appeared along the edges of cities. Small villages gained new community centers. Buses ran more often. Libraries opened their doors to larger crowds. Citizens, though still modest in their daily lives, began to expect more from their government, and the government, in turn, had more to give. This was the energy rush. But it was not wild. It was planned, structured, Dutch. The country had long prized control and order. Even in growth, they preferred balance. So the rush to develop and distribute gas was matched by a careful hand. The government worked closely with the companies involved. NAM, Shell, and Esso all cooperated under firm rules. Revenues were split, taxes collected. There was little corruption, few protests. Even the international press noted the Dutch efficiency. To the outside world, the Netherlands became a quiet success story. A small country, flat, unassuming, rich not from conquest or war, but from science and cooperation. Its people were educated, its systems strong, its windmills still turned, now joined by something new and invisible. Gas, like wind, could not be seen, but it could be felt. And as the gas kept flowing, its presence grew stronger. Factories began using gas for heat. Offices, too. Power plants switched from coal to gas, reducing pollution. Entire industries retooled to adapt. The gas boom was not only about money, it was about modernization. And with modernization came pride. Newspapers ran stories about Dutch engineering. Students were encouraged to study energy science. Public campaigns taught people how to use gas safely. Everything felt like progress, but progress often brings side effects. Small at first, then harder to ignore. One of the first signs was the shift in the labor market. As the gas sector grew, it began to pull workers away from other industries. Young people who once learned skills in metalwork or textiles began to look toward energy. Jobs in construction, transportation, and government infrastructure tied to the gas economy became more appealing. They paid better. They seemed more modern, more secure. Meanwhile, traditional factories began to slow. Textile mills in 20, once a proud center of Dutch manufacturing, reported fewer contracts. Toolmakers and machinists faced rising costs. Exporters found that their goods were now more expensive for foreign buyers. This was partly due to the strong guilder. As foreign money flowed into the country through gas sales, the currency rose in value. A strong guilder meant cheaper imports. Dutch consumers enjoyed more affordable foreign products, but it also meant that Dutch-made goods became harder to sell abroad. And so some factories began to close. At first, it was a few here and there. Small companies that could no longer compete. Then larger ones followed. The textile sector was hit especially hard. Machine shops, shipbuilders, and steel firms began to shrink. There was no crash, No collapse, just a quiet retreat. This, too, was part of the energy rush. As gas filled the national budget, it seemed to replace the need for industrial strength. Why work in a hot, loud factory when the country's wealth could now come from beneath the ground? For a time, this trade-off seemed acceptable. Wages rose in the public sector. Benefits improved. The government was generous with its new income. Citizens enjoyed better services, new buildings, cleaner air, and easier lives. But in the background, economists began to worry. They looked at the numbers. They studied the trends. They began to ask questions. Was the Dutch economy becoming too dependent on gas? Were other sectors being neglected? What would happen when the gas ran low? These questions were quiet at first, drowned out by the hum of progress, but they would grow louder in the years to come. For now, the energy rush continued. The Netherlands was changing, not all at once, not loudly, but deeply. Fields that once held only cows and crops now held pipelines and valves. Towns once known for wool and iron now hosted gas terminals and data centers. The country still looked the same on the surface: flat roads, red-roofed homes, bicycles parked beside canals. But underneath, the shape of its economy had shifted. The gas had brought comfort, speed, and new opportunity. And it had also begun to bring dependency. Like a river that carves a new path over many seasons, the flow of gas wealth was shaping the land and its people. No one could say yet what the final shape would be, but everyone, in their own way, had started to notice the change. In Slochteren, the original village where the first well was drilled, the sound of gas compressors now joined the birdsong in the fields. Farmers still planted rows of potatoes, but they did so with more curiosity. More visitors passed through now: engineers, inspectors, journalists. There was a new respect for the land, mixed with a quiet sense of unease. Something old had been disturbed, and something new had begun to rise. Part 4. A changing currency. The Dutch guilder was once a quiet symbol of trust. It was not the most famous currency in the world, nor the most powerful, but it was steady. People relied on it. Shopkeepers tucked paper notes into worn leather tills. Farmers paid their help with coins that had passed from hand to hand for years. Across the cities and towns of the Netherlands, the guilder held its value like a well-built bridge holds its shape, not flashy, but firm. In the early 1960s, as gas money began to flow into the country, something subtle began to change. The guilder grew stronger, not because of inflation, not because of war or chaos, but because of success. With every cubic meter of gas sold to other countries, foreign money entered the Dutch economy. Francs, marks, pounds, and lira flowed into banks in Amsterdam and The Hague. That foreign currency needed to be exchanged into guilders. And when many countries want to buy your currency, its value rises. At first, few people noticed. After all, a strong currency seemed like a good thing. And in some ways it was. Imports became cheaper. Goods from abroad, machinery, raw materials, foreign food products, all began to cost a little less. This pleased businesses that relied on imported parts. It also made life a bit easier for Dutch families. New household items like radios, stoves, and furniture became more affordable. Travel abroad became less expensive too. It felt like progress, like reward. But the story was more complicated. Because while a stronger guilder made buying foreign goods easier, it also made selling Dutch goods harder. Imagine a Dutch company that makes bicycles. Their bicycles are built with care. They are sturdy, reliable, and have a good reputation across Europe. They used to cost 100 guilders each. That price worked well for buyers in Germany, France, and Britain. But now, the guilder has gained value. To foreign buyers, those same 100 guilder bicycles now cost more in their own currency. The bicycles haven't changed. The materials are the same. The workers are the same. But the price to outsiders has gone up, and so fewer people buy them. This was not just a problem for bicycles. It happened with tools, Furniture, steel, chemicals, and textiles. All the goods the Netherlands had long exported with pride. These products became more expensive on the world market. Competitors in countries with weaker currencies could offer similar goods for less. As a result, Dutch exports began to slow. Factories noticed it first. Managers saw orders shrink. Production lines grew quiet. Some workers were laid off. Others had their hours reduced. It wasn't sudden. There were no dramatic announcements, just a gentle drift away from industry. Meanwhile, the gas money kept flowing. That revenue softened the impact. It allowed the government to support the economy in other ways. They could offer subsidies, training programs, or temporary support to companies under pressure. But the problem was growing, and it was not limited to trade. As the guilder rose in value, foreign investors took interest in the Dutch economy. They brought more money into the country, hoping to profit from the strength of the currency and the promise of gas-backed stability. This added even more pressure. The guilder continued to strengthen, and with it, the imbalance grew. More gas meant more money. More money meant a stronger guilder, and a stronger guilder made traditional industries weaker. The government faced a difficult puzzle. On one hand, the gas revenues were a gift. They paid for public services, kept taxes stable, and gave the country the means to grow. On the other hand, that same wealth was slowly damaging the industries that had long supported the Dutch economy. This was not just an economic question. It was a national one. The Netherlands had never been a country of showy wealth. It had built its identity on work, trade, skill, and order. To see those values challenged by a currency shift, one caused not by failure, but by success, was deeply unsettling. Some people in government began to explore ideas for how to manage the change. Could the guilder be controlled? Could gas revenues be used in a way that didn't harm other sectors? These questions were new. They had no easy answers. Meanwhile, everyday life continued. The streets of Amsterdam were busy with cyclists and trams. Cafes filled with people drinking coffee and reading newspapers. In the smaller towns, shopkeepers watched their ledgers with quiet attention. Some noticed fewer German customers than before. Others wondered why orders from abroad had slowed. In Rotterdam's port, longshoremen still loaded cargo. But some of the warehouses began to see more imports than exports. That change, too, was quiet, barely visible from outside. But those who watched closely began to see the pattern. The Netherlands was becoming a country that bought more than it sold. And while the gas money made that possible in the short term, it also carried risk. People began to ask, even if only in private, what happens when the gas runs out? What happens if the world changes and the demand slows? For now, those questions were easy to push aside. The fields of Groningen still held enormous reserves. The gas flowed steadily. The contracts were strong. The guilder stood tall, but economists were watching. In offices and lecture halls, they began to speak of a strange situation, one where success in one part of the economy harms another. A paradox of wealth. An unexpected curse. They did not have a name for it yet, but soon they would. In the meantime, the people of the Netherlands continued to live their lives. Children went to school in red brick buildings warmed by gas heaters. Office workers typed reports under flickering fluorescent lights. Teachers gave lessons in clean, bright classrooms. Hospitals expanded. Libraries bought new books. Bus lines extended into neighborhoods once hard to reach. It all looked like progress, and in many ways it was. But underneath, the currency kept shifting. The guilder, once a quiet symbol, had become a force of its own. It reflected a country changed by buried treasure, a treasure that had come without warning and brought both blessing and burden. The bicycle maker wondered why his orders from Belgium had dropped. The machine shop owner noticed the new parts coming in from Italy were cheaper than his own. The textile workers in the East watched foreign shirts arrive in Dutch stores for less than they could make their own. And through it all, the money from gas sales kept arriving. The Dutch government had more resources than ever before, but with them came choices. How should that money be used? Could it protect the old industries? Should it focus on building new ones? Would it last? In the coming years, these questions would rise more often. Voices would grow louder. And eventually, a name would be given to the pattern unfolding. But here, in the mid-1960s, the Netherlands remained in a strange place, growing richer, yet watching part of its foundation quietly wear away. Not from neglect, not from error, but from the quiet strength of its own success. Part 5. The factory floor grows quiet. Factories have their own music. It is not the kind played by instruments or heard on radios, but it is music all the same. It begins with the clatter of metal, the hum of motors, the steady rhythm of machines at work. Each hammer, each drill, each spinning gear adds to the sound. Mixed with voices, footsteps, and the occasional whistle, the song of the factory becomes a kind of heartbeat. For decades, that sound had filled many corners of the Netherlands. In Eindhoven, machines stamped and pressed steel into useful shapes. In Enschede, looms wove threads into cloth, filling warehouses with folded fabric. In Rotterdam, shipbuilders assembled great vessels from curved plates and rivets. In smaller towns, toolmakers, glassworkers, furniture builders, and others formed a quiet network of skilled labor. These factories were more than workplaces. They were schools of trade, sources of pride, and anchors for communities. Each shift began with greetings among workers, the sharp smell of oil and grease in the air. Men and women stood at their stations, practiced hands moving through familiar tasks. There was satisfaction in that work, in the finished product, in the shared effort. But as the 1960s moved forward, something changed. It did not happen suddenly. No one moment marked its beginning. It came like the turning of a season, slow and quiet. Orders began to fall. A factory that once filled large crates for foreign buyers now filled only half as many. Export contracts grew harder to win. Foreign companies could offer similar goods at lower prices, not because they were better, but because their currencies were weaker. The strong Dutch guilder, once a point of pride, had begun to turn. It helped buy things cheaply from abroad, but it also made Dutch products too expensive for many buyers outside the country. Factories felt this shift before most others. Managers tried to adapt. They spoke with suppliers. They looked for cheaper materials. They asked workers to do more with less. But even with adjustments, the numbers kept falling. The textile mills in the East were among the first to feel the strain. Their cloth, once prized for its quality, now faced competition from countries where labor cost less and currencies were weaker. One by one, small mills closed their doors. In some towns, empty windows looked out over streets that once bustled with workers. In the steel industry, too, things began to slow. Demand from abroad faded. Orders from shipyards dropped. Machines sat still longer between jobs. Workers who once ran them stood with hands in their pockets, waiting for the next shipment that never came. These changes were hard to explain. To the outside world, the Dutch economy was still growing. The gas revenues made sure of that. Government budgets were full. New buildings rose in the cities. Roads were paved. Schools expanded. But in the quiet corners of factory towns, the story was different. There was no celebration in the silence of an unused machine. No comfort in the closing of a shop that had stood for 3 generations. No joy in seeing one's skill slowly lose value, not because it was no longer needed, but because it had become too costly to keep. Some workers retrained. Others moved to different towns. Some found jobs in construction, energy, or public service supported by government spending. But not everyone found a new place easily. For older workers especially, the change came with sadness. They had spent years shaping metal or guiding looms, building not just goods, but lives. Now those lives were shifting. In many towns, people noticed more empty storefronts, cafes with fewer customers, train stations with quieter mornings. The factory floor, once a place of motion and noise, began to echo. There were still jobs, still work to be done, But something had changed in the balance. The country had moved towards something new, powered by natural gas and rising wealth. But in doing so, it had leaned away from the hands that once built its goods and shaped its exports. The decline of industry was not a fall. It was more like a fading, a quiet retreat, felt more than heard. And for many, it brought questions. Was this just a part of modern progress? Were the changes necessary? Was the gas a gift or a weight? In some homes, families talked of better things. Heating bills were lower now, roads smoother, schools offered more. The children had new books and newer shoes. Life was not worse, it was changing. But for those whose work had lived in the factories, the change was harder to hold. They remembered the feel of the machines, the smell of fresh metal, the way steam rose in the mornings, the soft thud of work boots on concrete floors. They remembered when their town had hummed with purpose. The government began to notice, too. Reports came in showing a pattern. Industry was shrinking, even as the national economy grew. Exports were weakening, even with strong infrastructure. The signs pointed not to crisis, but to imbalance. Some economists gave quiet warnings. They spoke of deindustrialization, of sectors left behind, of the need to balance natural wealth with long-term strength. They pointed to the gas, not with blame, but with caution. The gas had brought wealth, but it had also changed the country's shape. It made the currency strong. It funded public services. But it also made some work less valuable, less protected, less able to compete. This was not failure, but it was change. And change brings both light and shadow. In the newspapers, a few voices began to ask what came next. Could the Netherlands remain strong if it lost its industries? Would the gas last forever? Should the country build new strengths before the old ones faded too far? These questions echoed through offices, parliament halls, and homes. In some places, they were answered with hope. New industries were rising: electronics, design, science, and services. Universities trained students in fields that had barely existed a generation before. Dutch minds were still sharp, Dutch hands still skilled, but the loss of factories could not be ignored. They had once been the backbone. And now, piece by piece, they were growing quiet. In the town of Almelo, a machinist walked past the workshop where he had worked for 20 years. The lights were off, the doors locked. He stood for a moment, remembering the sound of turning lathes and the rhythm of drills. He did not speak. He simply walked on. In another town, a weaver rolled up the last piece of cloth from her loom. The mill would not reopen. Her daughters, she thought, would not follow in her footsteps. They would learn computers, perhaps, or study business, or work in healthcare. She was proud of them. But she also felt something closing behind her. And in the offices of The Hague, policymakers read reports. They saw the same numbers again and again: rising gas revenue, shrinking exports, more money in the budget. Fewer goods made it home. The factory floor had grown quiet, not from neglect, not from disaster, but from the calm tide of a country changing course. And somewhere beneath the flat fields of Groningen, the gas still flowed. Part 6. Economists begin to worry. In tall buildings and quiet offices, far from the gas wells and factory floors, a different kind of work was taking place. It was the work of watching numbers. Economists, researchers, and civil servants sat at wide desks, their eyes scanning rows of data. They read reports, drew graphs, and typed slowly into machines that clicked and hummed. They watched the flow of trade, the strength of the currency, the rise of employment in some sectors, and the fall in others. These were not noisy people. They did not build ships or sew clothes or work the land, but they saw patterns. They studied what others often missed. And now, some of them had begun to worry. The Dutch economy looked strong on the surface. The gas fields of Groningen were producing vast amounts of energy. Export contracts were being signed across Europe. The government was earning billions in revenue. New buildings were rising. Roads were being repaired. Public services were expanding. But beneath this smooth image, something was off. Some graphs did not move in the right direction. Some industries were shrinking, not growing. Some regions were losing jobs, even as the country became wealthier overall. This contradiction drew the attention of a few careful minds. They started with the question, why was Dutch manufacturing in decline while the rest of the economy was doing so well? The answers were not simple. At first, some believed it was just a matter of global change. Other countries had cheaper labor. Technology was evolving. Perhaps the factories would have slowed anyway. But the deeper the economists looked, the more they saw something unique about the Netherlands. The currency had become very strong, pulled upward by the constant flow of foreign money from gas sales. That strong currency made Dutch exports harder to sell. It also made imports cheaper, which hurt local producers. This idea was not new. Economists had long known that large inflows of money could change a currency's value and affect trade. But what made the Dutch case different was the scale. The gas field in Groningen was not small. It was enormous, and it had quickly become one of the most important forces in the country's economy. It was changing more than just trade. It was reshaping the national balance. By the late 1960s, a few voices inside the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs began to raise concerns. They prepared memos and internal reports. They spoke of over-dependence, of sectoral imbalances, of currency pressure. These words were technical. Most people outside government and finance did not hear them. But inside the quiet halls where decisions were made, they mattered. One early report described what it called a situation where the income from natural resources creates pressure on other productive sectors. Another warned that temporary revenue from gas must not lead to permanent weakness elsewhere. Still, these concerns were small compared to the praise. The Dutch government was widely admired for its success in managing the gas industry. Other countries looked to the Netherlands as a model. There was little corruption. The public benefited directly. Services improved. Stability remained. So the voices of concern were easy to overlook. But they did not go away. As more data came in, the pattern became harder to ignore. The trade balance was shifting. The share of manufacturing in the national economy was shrinking. Some regions that once thrived on production now relied on government support. The economy had become more centralized, more dependent on a single stream of income. It was around this time that a new term began to circulate. It did not come from a Dutch economist. It appeared first in a British magazine, The Economist, in 1977. The article looked at the Dutch experience and gave it a name: the Dutch disease. It was not a disease in the usual sense. There was no virus, no fever, no infection. But it described a condition, a slow weakening of part of the economy, caused not by failure, but by success in another part. The article explained how the discovery and export of natural gas had made the Dutch guilder rise in value. That rise, in turn, made exports less competitive. It made manufacturing decline. It created a gap between energy wealth and industrial strength. The term was simple, even a little playful, but it stuck. Soon, economists in other countries began using it too. It became a way to describe what could go wrong when a country became rich too quickly from one resource. The Dutch disease became a warning, not just to the Netherlands, but to the world. And yet, in the Netherlands itself, the term was met with mixed feelings. Some dismissed it. They said the Dutch economy was still healthy, that new sectors were growing, that the gas had brought great benefits. And they were right, at least partly. Others took it seriously. They began to ask new questions. Could the damage to industry be reversed? Was the country ready for a future without gas? Had the government planned for what might come next? Inside the halls of Parliament, debates began to shift. New policies were discussed. Some called for investment in other sectors. Others proposed saving part of the gas revenue for the future. There were ideas about education, innovation, regional support, and export incentives. But change was not easy. The gas money kept coming. The pressure to spend it was strong. Citizens wanted better roads, better schools, better pensions. And why not? It was their country's wealth, their national treasure. Still, the economists kept writing. In journals, in reports, in quiet papers passed from one desk to another. They described what they saw, not with drama, but with detail. They showed how jobs had shifted from manufacturing to service sectors. They explained how currency strength could act like a quiet tide, lifting some boats while leaving others stuck in the sand. They argued that long-term balance required more than short-term gain. Some of their ideas began to take root. Universities opened new programs focused on economic policy. Young students studied the Dutch disease as a case in their textbooks. Government departments began to include long-term planning in their reports. Research funding supported efforts to understand how to manage national wealth without weakening the rest of the economy. And yet, the problem was not easily solved. There was no switch to flip, no simple fix. What had been lost in the factories could not be rebuilt overnight. What had been gained from the gas was still real, still valuable. But it had come with a price, a quiet price. One felt not in the big cities or the grand offices, but in the smaller towns, the silent workshops, the closed gates of once busy mills. The economists saw this. They wrote about it not as critics, but as observers, as people trying to understand the balance between natural wealth and national strength. Some said the Dutch disease was not just about gas. It was about choices, about how a country responds to change, about what it chooses to protect and what it allows to fade. In the years that followed, their work would guide new policies. It would influence how other countries handled their own resource booms. It would become part of a global conversation. But here, in the quiet offices of the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was just beginning. The worry had taken root. The term had been born, and the search for answers had begun. Part 7. Jobs that drift away. In every country, there are stories hidden behind numbers. When a report says that exports are down, someone is packing away tools for the last time. When a chart shows job losses in manufacturing, someone is folding their uniform and turning off the factory lights. In the Netherlands during the late 1960s and early 1970s, those quiet goodbyes began to happen more often. The country was still moving forward. On paper, the economy looked strong. The streets of Amsterdam were busy. Schools were full. Construction sites hammered out the future. Natural gas continued to pour in from the fields in Groningen, bringing wealth and comfort to millions. But elsewhere, out of sight from the headlines, work was starting to drift away. In a village not far from Enschede, there was once a factory that made fabric for uniforms. It wasn't large, but it had been part of the town for generations. Mothers had worked the looms, and later their daughters did too. The machines filled the long brick building with a low, steady clatter. The workers knew the rhythm so well they could speak over it without shouting. One morning, a notice was posted near the entrance. The company had lost a major contract. Prices were too high. They couldn't compete with newer mills abroad. Management would try to hold on, but the outlook was not good. The workers read the sign in silence. Some of them folded their arms. Others looked down at the floor. One woman simply nodded, then walked away. It wasn't just one factory. It was many. In Rotterdam, a small ship repair yard closed its gates. In Utrecht, a printing company that once exported books to 3 countries laid off half its workers. In the north, a machine shop that built agricultural tools shut its doors for good. Each closure had its own reasons, but there was a common thread. The currency was strong, too strong. Dutch goods were more expensive on the world market. Other countries had cheaper labor and better exchange rates. The Netherlands, for all its skills and systems, could no longer compete in the same way. And so the work began to shift. Not all at once, not loudly, but day by day, contract by contract, job by job. For the people affected, the changes were more than economic. They were personal. A man who had worked in steel for 30 years sat at home, his hands still stained with grease. He watched his tools grow dusty. His son, who had planned to follow in his path, chose instead to study economics at university. A woman who had sewn curtains for a decade joined a part-time cleaning service. She no longer worked with fabric, but she still folded things carefully, as if each cloth still mattered. Younger workers began looking elsewhere. Some trained for office jobs. Others applied for work with the gas companies or the growing public service sector. The government, with its gas wealth, offered stable pay and steady hours. It became one of the country's largest employers. For a while, it seemed like the country was adapting. If one kind of work disappeared, another took its place. But the truth was more complex. Not all workers could shift easily. Not every job could be replaced. And not every town had a new path forward. In some regions, especially in the east and north, unemployment began to rise. The small cities built around manufacturing found fewer reasons for young people to stay. Shops closed, cafes emptied, schools saw fewer students. The energy wealth from the gas was real, but it did not reach everyone equally. Some places thrived, others faded. The jobs that had once given people purpose, pride, and place began to drift, not because of failure, but because the rules of the game had changed. In The Hague, officials took note. They created programs for retraining, offered incentives for new businesses, spent gas revenue on infrastructure, hoping to spark local growth. In some cases, these efforts helped. In others, they were not enough, because the loss was not just about income. It was about identity. A town that once built machines now sold insurance. A school that once trained carpenters now taught computer basics. A man who once led a team of 10 now worked alone at a desk, answering phones. No one blamed the gas, not out loud. It had brought comfort and progress. It had improved lives in many ways, but there was an unspoken feeling that something old was being left behind too quickly, and something new was arriving without shape or soul. Economists spoke of structural change. Newspapers wrote about the shifting landscape. Politicians used words like modernization and efficiency. But for the people whose jobs had drifted away, the words didn't quite match what they felt. They felt loss. Not a sharp loss, not a sudden fall, but the kind of loss that comes like a slow tide, erasing old footsteps from the sand. In a fishing town along the coast, a father and son stood at the harbor, looking out at the water. The boats were still there, but fewer went out now. The fish market had been replaced by a tourist cafe. The son asked if he should take a course in computer science. The father nodded. He understood. In the south, a small town held a farewell party for its last working factory. The mayor gave a speech. A local band played songs from the 1950s. Some people smiled. Some cried. The jobs were not just drifting across borders. They were drifting across time. And in the distance, the gas fields of Groningen continued their quiet work. The pipelines carried energy across Europe. The wealth entered national accounts. The government had plans, budgets, and hopes, but none of it could bring back the exact kind of work that had been lost. And maybe that was the hardest part. The feeling that no one had done anything wrong. That the people had worked hard, done their best, followed the rules, and still the ground had shifted beneath them. Not because of failure, but because the world had changed, and with it, the value of certain skills, places, and paths. It left a question floating in the air. What kind of work truly lasts? And who gets to decide? There was no easy answer. But across the Netherlands, in living rooms and workshops, in schools and small businesses, people quietly searched for new ways forward. Some found them, others waited. And some simply watched the jobs drift away, like small boats carried off by a current no one could quite see. Part 8. The Lessons Not Yet Learned. In the years after the Dutch discovered their vast gas reserves, the world watched with interest. Many countries admired the way the Netherlands handled its new wealth. There had been no chaos, no corruption scandals, no sudden rise of oligarchs or collapse of institutions. Instead, there had been careful planning, calm leadership, and steady growth. From the outside, it looked like a success story. A small country had uncovered great resources and used them wisely. But inside the country, quiet voices had begun to tell a different story. Economists had noticed the fading strength of industry. Workers had watched jobs slip away. Some towns had lost their sense of purpose. The gas had brought comfort and wealth, but it had also brought change, a deep shift in the way the economy worked. That shift would later be named the Dutch disease. And yet, while the Netherlands had already begun to live with its consequences, other countries were only just beginning to make similar discoveries and repeat similar mistakes. Around the world, natural resources were being found in soil, stone, and sea. In Venezuela, the ground gave up oil in great rivers. In Nigeria, dark crude flowed from the swamps and delta. In Russia, pipelines stretched across the cold earth. In the Middle East, desert sands revealed oceans of oil. In each of these places, leaders and citizens alike believed they had found their future. Their countries would be rich. Their people would be lifted from poverty. Their governments would be strong. And in the early years, it often seemed true. Like the Netherlands, these countries saw money pour into their budgets. Public projects were launched. Roads were built. Cities grew. Leaders spoke of transformation, but beneath the surface, familiar patterns began to form. Currencies grew stronger. Exports unrelated to the new resource became harder to sell. Industries outside oil or gas were neglected. Factories that once built machines or processed food began to close. Workers moved to jobs linked to the new wealth. And slowly, as had happened in the Netherlands, the economies tilted, not toward balance, but toward dependence. Dependence on one resource, one market, one flow of income. In Venezuela, this change was especially sharp. The country had once been proud of its agriculture and local industry. But after oil became the main source of income, other sectors were left behind. When oil prices were high, the country felt rich. But when prices dropped, there was little to fall back on. Food had to be imported. Factories sat unused. The economy rose and fell with the price of crude. In Nigeria, a similar story unfolded. Oil brought massive revenue, but little of it reached the people. Farming declined. Manufacturing was overlooked. Corruption grew. The money was there, but it was not shared. And when the oil market shifted, the country struggled. In Russia, too, the wealth from gas and oil shaped the economy. For many years, it provided strength. But as time passed, leaders realized that too much had been built on one foundation. They had not learned the lesson of the Netherlands. Or perhaps they had seen it, but believed their case would be different. It is easy to believe that. Every country believes it has a special path, a unique situation, a different kind of control. But the rules of economics are quiet and stubborn. They follow patterns, not pride. And the pattern of the Dutch disease began to appear again and again. Resource wealth arrived. Other industries weakened. The economy became unbalanced. In time, the weakness showed. Some countries tried to hide it. Others ignored it. A few tried to fix it, but found it harder than expected. The truth is that once a country leans too far in one direction, standing up straight again takes more than money. It takes time, skill, and deep reflection. The Netherlands by then was already reflecting. It had been the first to live the story, the first to feel the benefits and the cost. And now it watched as others walked the same path, still unaware of the lessons waiting ahead. There is a strange pain in seeing someone else make the same mistake you once made. It is not easy to warn them. Words are not always enough. Because when the oil is new or the gas is fresh, it feels like magic. It feels like luck. It feels like a reward. And no one wants to hear that it may also bring risk. The Dutch tried to share what they had learned. Economists spoke at conferences. Policy advisors offered quiet advice. Articles were published, studies were shared, but few listened at first. In each new country, the belief was the same. This time will be different. This time the wealth will lift everyone. This time we will plan better. This time the market will stay strong. This time the jobs will remain. But the pattern returned, over and over, not always in the same way. Not always with the same result, but the rhythm was familiar. Wealth from the ground, a rising currency, a weakening of other exports, a loss of diversity in the economy, a growing dependence. Some countries tried to fight it with policy. They set up savings funds. Norway, for example, created a fund to hold oil revenue for the future. Others taxed their resource exports and used the money to support other sectors. These were smart moves. In some cases, they helped, but in many places, the deeper lesson was missed. That wealth from resources is not always a blessing. That sometimes it must be handled like fire, useful but dangerous. That balance, not riches, is the true strength of a nation. Back in the Netherlands, this thought grew clearer each year. The country had not collapsed. It had not fallen into deep poverty. It remained strong in many ways, but the loss of its industrial base, the dependence on gas, and the quiet fading of jobs had left a mark. The lesson, if anything, was not about disaster. It was about what happens when success is not balanced with care. And as the world looked toward the promise of oil, gas, and minerals, that lesson remained waiting. Still clear, still simple, still not yet learned. Part 9. The Invisible Trap. Some traps are made of wire and spring. They snap shut, loud and sudden. Others are quiet. They are not built with force, but with comfort. They do not frighten. They do not wound. They simply hold you softly while the world moves on. The Dutch disease was like that. It did not strike the Netherlands with panic or collapse. It arrived gently. It gave first. Then it took. It began with discovery, a field of gas beneath the green soil of Groningen. It brought heat to homes, light to cities, and wealth to the treasury. It raised living standards. It created jobs and energy in construction, in public service. For a while, it felt like progress. But behind the comfort, something invisible was taking shape. The economy began to lean, not toward disaster, but toward imbalance. Gas became the strongest voice in the national story. The other voices, the quiet work of factories, the steady hands of builders, the small-town industries were still there, but harder to hear. The country had not stopped producing, but it had started depending on one thing, on one gift from the ground. This is the invisible trap. When something works too well, it asks for trust. And the Netherlands gave that trust to gas. Why wouldn't it? The revenue was strong. The gas fields were vast. The economy was growing. But dependence builds slowly. It doesn't announce itself. It feels at first like efficiency. Why build more factories if gas pays the bills? Why invest in exports if the energy market brings in enough? Why worry about the future when the present is so bright? These are not foolish questions. They are understandable, even logical, but they carry a danger. Because wealth that comes from one source, even a good one, can make a country forget what built it in the first place. In the Netherlands, what had built the country was not gas. It was balance. For centuries, the Dutch had relied on many things: trade, agriculture, industry, science, education, water management, and quiet cooperation. These threads had been woven together over time, forming something strong and flexible. But gas pulled on that fabric. Not harshly, not cruelly, just enough to loosen the threads. As gas became more important, other sectors began to shrink, not because they failed, but because they could not compete with the strength of the currency that gas helped create. The factories grew quiet. The export businesses lost ground. Skilled workers retrained or left. Whole regions once centered around industry began to look for new purpose, and the country, without ever deciding to do so, placed more and more of its weight on one pillar. That is how the trap works. It does not close in a single moment. It closes by small degrees, by habits, by assumptions, by the steady choice to follow the easiest path. Economists warned about it. They showed the numbers. They used new terms like deindustrialization and sectoral imbalance. They spoke about over-reliance, but numbers alone do not change hearts. The gas money kept coming. People lived better. Services improved. The cities became cleaner, more connected, more advanced. The present looked fine. And so the deeper questions were set aside. Questions like, what happens if the gas runs out? What happens if prices fall? What happens if technology changes? What happens if other countries find their own gas? These questions waited quietly at the edge of policy discussions. Sometimes they were asked. Sometimes they were not. But the invisible trap had already done its work. The Dutch economy, once spread across many sectors, now leaned too heavily on one. Not because of greed, not because of failure, but because of trust in something that had once been a gift and slowly became a weight. Some people saw the signs in their own lives. A man who once ran a factory now managed a local office for the energy company. He had work, he had pay, but something felt missing. The machines he once cared for were gone. The tools, the noise, the pride of making, all had faded. A town that once sent goods to 5 countries now sent students to the capital for jobs and finance. The train still ran. The streets were still swept, but something had shifted in the spirit of the place. And in the government's books, the numbers looked good. That was the hardest part. The numbers said success, but the feeling said something else. It said drift. It said quiet loss. It said weight resting on a single beam while the others were left to rot. And yet, even then, the full shape of the trap had not been seen. It would take years before the gas slowed, before the markets changed, before new challenges arrived. Only then would the country look back and see how far it had leaned. Only then would the questions grow louder. But here, in the years after the first concerns had been raised and before any great change had come, the Netherlands stood inside the trap, warm, safe, and slowly forgetting how it had walked in. The lessons were there, waiting, but the comfort was stronger. And the comfort held the door closed, just a little tighter each year. Part 10. A World of Resource Curses. The story of the Netherlands was not the only one of its kind. While the gas fields of Groningen shaped the Dutch economy in quiet ways, other countries around the world were experiencing similar patterns, some with oil, others with minerals, diamonds, or copper. Each country's path was different. Each land had its own people, its own history, its own decisions. But something about natural wealth often followed a strange pattern. It began with hope. It grew with money. It ended in something more difficult to explain. Economists would later call it the resource curse, a name that sounds strange, even a little harsh for something that starts with a gift. But the gift was never simple, and in time it began to show its weight. Take Venezuela. In the middle of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America. Its oil fields were vast. Its economy was rising. The streets of Caracas filled with new cars, tall buildings, and signs of modern life. Oil money flowed into government programs. New roads were built. Public services expanded. Leaders spoke of becoming the next great nation. But behind the growth, the same quiet pattern unfolded. The Venezuelan currency grew stronger. Manufacturing declined. Farming weakened. The country, full of oil, began to import food. People moved from rural areas into cities, searching for oil jobs. But the oil industry could not hire everyone. Soon, a small number of people earned large profits, while many others waited for promises that did not come. When oil prices dropped, as they often do, the economy fell quickly, and there was little left to hold it up. The trap had been built with wealth, but it still held firm. In Nigeria, the story echoed again. In the 1960s, Nigeria discovered large reserves of oil in the Niger Delta. Expectations rose fast. The country had natural riches. The world needed oil. What could go wrong? At first, the government earned billions in revenue. But those billions did not reach the people. Corruption grew. Funds were lost. Farming and small industries were pushed aside. The oil fields became places of conflict. The land was damaged. Rivers were polluted. Whole communities were left behind. Like the Dutch gas, Nigerian oil became the main source of income. But unlike the Netherlands, where systems of governance were more stable, Nigeria struggled to control the power that came with such wealth. And so, the curse deepened. Then there was Russia, a country with great natural gas and oil reserves, especially in the cold stretches of Siberia and beyond. For many years, these resources gave Russia strength on the world stage. Energy exports paid for government projects, military expansion, and political influence. But at home, the pattern repeated. Other sectors remained weak. Innovation slowed. The economy depended too heavily on a market it could not control. And when prices fell or when trade partners changed, the pain was felt across the nation. These stories are not the same in every way, but they share a center. Natural wealth, whether gas, oil, copper, or gold, can bring great promise. But if it becomes too important, it begins to change everything around it. It lifts the currency. It reshapes the job market. It pulls talent and investment away from other parts of the economy. It creates winners and leaves others behind. And when the market turns or the resource runs low, the damage becomes clear. This is the world of the resource curse, a world where the gift of the earth becomes a challenge for the people who walk on it, not because they are ungrateful, not because they are foolish, but because the wealth arrived fast and its effects came slowly. And when something moves slowly, it is hard to see until it is already deeply felt. In the Netherlands, the story had been quieter. The country was more stable. Its institutions were strong. The damage came gently, in falling exports, in quiet factories, in shifting jobs. But elsewhere, the fall was harder. Some countries saw violence. Some lost entire generations of skilled workers. Some watched their democracy fade, all because too much was placed in one basket, and the basket came from the ground. There were efforts to escape the curse. In Norway, oil was discovered in the North Sea during the 1960s, not far, in fact, from the Dutch gas fields. But Norway made different choices. It created a sovereign wealth fund. It saved much of its oil revenue. It invested in schools, in transportation, and long-term planning. It spread the wealth across society, and even then the risk remained. Norwegian leaders warned that dependence on oil could still unbalance the economy, so they continued to plan, to save, to watch. Other countries tried too. Some built funds, some limited spending, some invested in new industries. But success was not easy, because the resource curse is not just about money. It is about attention. When a resource becomes too important, it begins to shape the way people think. It becomes the center of conversation, of planning, of identity. And slowly, the rest is forgotten. That is the deeper danger, that a country built on many strong legs begins to walk on only one. And when that leg weakens, the fall is hard. So the lesson of the Dutch disease became more than a local concern. It became a mirror for the world. A reminder that even good fortune must be managed with care. That true wealth is not what lies beneath the soil, but what rises from the hands, minds, and hearts of the people above it. And that balance, not riches, is what carries a country forward. Not every nation would learn that lesson in time. Some still have not, but the story remains, waiting for those who choose to look, not as a warning in bold letters, but as a quiet truth, one told again and again, in factories gone still, in farms left behind, in towns that once thrived on work, now searching for new meaning, and in the silence that follows a gift too heavily trusted. Part 11: Policies and Pivots. When something changes slowly, it takes time to notice. And when something powerful brings both good and harm, it takes even longer to know what to do. In the years after the Dutch disease began to show itself, not as a theory, but as a lived experience, the Netherlands and many other countries began to ask the same quiet question. How do we fix this? There was no single answer. No one-size-fits-all plan. But there were steps, small ones at first, careful ones. Because when a nation is walking forward on soft ground, its next move must be steady. In the Netherlands, the first step was understanding. Economists, planners, and policymakers studied the changing shape of the economy. They looked at how natural gas revenue had affected manufacturing, exports, employment, and wages. They read the reports. They watched the graphs. They listened. And they began to accept that the wealth from gas, while helpful, had also done harm. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, deeply. The next step was discussion. Within the halls of government, experts gathered around long tables. Ministers spoke with civil servants. Members of parliament listened to economists. University scholars offered models and case studies. Some voices called for caution. Others called for change. And between them, a new idea began to take shape. The idea of managing wealth, not spending it all, not letting it carry the country too far in one direction, but using it to build something stronger, something that would last beyond the gas. The Netherlands began to think differently about its future. And in doing so, it joined a wider conversation. Other countries were beginning to face the same questions. In Norway, where oil had been discovered offshore, leaders studied the Dutch case closely. They saw what could happen when natural wealth was not balanced with careful policy. And so, Norway made a choice. A clear, quiet choice. They would not spend all the oil money as it came in. Instead, they would save it. They would create a fund, a large national account to hold the wealth for the future. It would be invested, it would grow, and it would not be used for daily spending, except under strict rules. This was the start of what would later become one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. It was not just about money, it was about trust, about giving future generations the same chance as the present, and it was about balance. Norway also invested in education, healthcare, and public services. They supported local industries. They made sure that oil was part of the economy, but not all of it. Other countries tried similar things. Some created stabilization funds, accounts to hold money during good times, so it could be used during bad times. Others introduced taxes on oil and gas profits, using the money to support other parts of the economy. Some focused on education, retraining workers, and helping them move from one type of job to another. In some places, these efforts worked. In others, they struggled. Because managing wealth is not just about numbers. It is about people, about choices, about habits and hopes. In the Netherlands, the government tried to shift spending away from short-term comfort and toward long-term strength. They invested in research and development. They supported new industries, technology, design, clean energy, and education. They worked to rebuild parts of the economy that had been left behind. The path was not straight. There were challenges. Some programs moved too slowly. Others faced public resistance. People had become used to certain benefits. Changing course meant asking hard questions. Should the gas revenue be saved or spent? Should taxes rise in one place to lower pressure in another? Should failing industries be rescued or allowed to change? These were not easy questions, but they were necessary, because doing nothing meant continuing to lean. And leaning too far in one direction eventually leads to falling. So the Netherlands chose quietly to correct its course. Not with big speeches, not with sudden moves, but with steady hands. It began with small reforms, changes in tax policy, adjustments to education funding, support for business innovation, grants for new technology, programs for rural areas. Each step was a pivot, a turn away from full dependence and back toward balance. Over time, the effects became visible. New companies began to grow in areas that had once been industrial. Universities became centers of knowledge, offering tools for a changing world. Design firms, software companies, and clean energy groups began to take root. The Netherlands would never be exactly as it was before the gas, but it would no longer be carried only by it. And that was the point: to stand again on many legs, to find strength not in one gift, but in many hands. Other countries watched. Some followed. Some did not. In countries where governance was weak, or where leaders sought short-term gain, the resource curse took hold more deeply. The wealth came quickly. The damage came slowly. And by the time change was needed, it was harder to make. Because the more a country leans on one thing, the harder it is to stand without it. But where policies were strong, and where leaders looked beyond the next election, the story could be different. It took time. It took care. But balance could return. The lesson, again and again, was simple. Wealth alone is not the answer. It must be shaped, guided, used to build something broader. And that takes policy. That takes planning. That takes quiet pivots year after year until the ground feels firm again. The Netherlands learned this the hard way. But it learned, and in learning, it gave others a path to follow. A reminder that even when change comes slow, it can still come true. Part 12. The Dutch adjust their course. There are moments in a nation's story when the loudest changes do not come from big events, but from quiet reflection. In the Netherlands, after years of growing comfort from its natural gas wealth, the time came to step back, not with fear, but with care. The country had enjoyed many years of steady growth. Homes were warm, roads were smooth, schools were full. The economy looked strong from above. But underneath, thoughtful minds had begun to notice what was shifting. Gas, once a new opportunity, had become the center of too much. Factories had slowed. Exports had dropped. Some workers had moved on. Others had been left behind. The balance that once made the Dutch economy so flexible, the mix of trade, farming, industry, and invention, had started to tilt. The people of the Netherlands were not careless. They were cautious by nature, steady and practical. They did not rush into things. And when they saw something was off, they did not panic. They adjusted, quietly, thoughtfully. Like steering a boat across a slow-moving canal, they turned the wheel little by little, checking the water ahead, feeling the current beneath. In the 1980s, the need to adjust became clearer. Oil prices dropped across the world. The global energy market shifted. Gas revenues, once reliable, became harder to count on. At the same time, more signs appeared at home. Industrial regions faced higher unemployment. Small towns needed support. Young people left for cities. Older workers found fewer jobs in their trades. The government responded with care. One of the first steps was decentralization, giving more power and resources to local governments. If problems looked different in each region, then the solutions could look different too. Funds were directed toward towns in need. Training centers opened. Old factories were turned into learning spaces, design studios, or technology labs. The goal was not to return to the past. The past had changed. Instead, the goal was to build new forms of strength. ones that would last beyond gas. The Netherlands also looked to education. If the country could no longer rely on low-cost manufacturing, it would focus on skill, knowledge, and creativity. Investment in universities grew. Research centers were expanded. Teachers were given new tools and programs. Students were encouraged to study science, engineering, language, and design. The idea was simple. Natural gas had given the country warmth and wealth, but minds would carry it forward. Over time, new industries began to grow. In places once known for steel, small firms began to produce clean energy equipment. In regions where textiles had faded, design schools opened their doors. The service sector expanded. Banking, law, logistics, and digital services found new ground. Technology became a focus. Dutch engineers developed water systems, flood defenses, and energy networks that were admired around the world. Cities began to hum with different kinds of work. Not louder, just newer. In Rotterdam, once a city of ships and cranes, architects began to build new towers. Designers filled old warehouses with quiet ambition. The port still worked, it always had, but around it, new paths opened. In Eindhoven, a city once powered by Philips factories, light took a new form. Students at the university built solar panels, tested electric vehicles, and wrote code. In Groningen, where the gas fields had first been found, people asked hard questions about the land. Because in time, the gas itself had started to push back. Small earthquakes, caused by years of gas extraction, began to shake the region. Not large, not deadly, but unsettling. Homes cracked, walls shifted, families worried, and the country listened. The government faced new choices. The gas had given much, but now it gave with a price. In response, production was reduced. Safety funds were set aside. Residents were supported. Laws were updated. And slowly, another truth became clearer. Even the richest well runs dry. It does not happen in a day, but the signs come year by year. And so the Netherlands chose not to wait. Diversification became more than an idea. It became a plan. Public spending shifted again. Taxes were adjusted to encourage growth in different areas. Entrepreneurs were given more space to create. Local leaders worked with national programs to revive towns in ways that fit their strengths. Some focused on tourism, others on tech, some on culture, and others on logistics or green energy. Throughout it all, one word returned again and again: balance. That was what had been lost. That was what needed to return. And it did, not all at once, but in steps. By the 1990s, the Dutch economy was no longer leaning quite so heavily on gas. By the 2000s, the conversation around energy had shifted towards sustainability and transition. By the 2010s, the country was investing in solar, wind, and green innovation. By the 2020s, the gas fields that had once defined so much were now quieter. And through those years, the lessons stayed close. That natural wealth is not forever. That comfort can hide slow decline. That the true power of a country is in its people, not what lies beneath, but what rises from their minds, their hands, and their choices. The Dutch adjusted their course with care. They did not erase the past. They honored it. They did not reject what the gas had given. They used it well, but they did not let it become everything. And that is what mattered most. In the end, the adjustment was not dramatic. It was steady, like a tide rolling back, revealing old stones and new sand. Like a ship turning gently to face the wind. Like a nation remembering how it once stood, not on one strong leg, but on many. And with that memory, walking forward once again. Part 13, Balance Restored. There are stories where the ending is clear. A problem is solved. A victory is won. The page turns and everything feels settled. But in real life, the endings are softer. More like slow sunsets than sharp full stops. In the Netherlands, the years after the gas boom brought with them reflection. Not regret, exactly, but a quiet need to look back, to understand, to measure what had changed. There was much to be proud of. The country had taken a bold step in the 1960s when it began drawing gas from deep under the fields of Groningen. It used that wealth to raise living standards, to support public services, and to build a better life for millions. The homes were warmer. The schools were stronger. The cities were brighter. The country had avoided many of the worst outcomes seen in other resource-rich nations. There had been no great collapse, no civil war, no runaway corruption or violent unrest. The Dutch government had remained strong. Institutions had held. The people had continued to trust the system that guided them. And yet, there had been a cost. It was not always spoken out loud, but it was there. A soft cost, a shifting of the ground, a feeling that something valuable had been worn down over time. In the factory towns that had once been full of life, the machines no longer roared. In villages that had once exported goods across Europe, the docks were quiet. The jobs that gave rhythm to the day and pride to the worker had changed or moved or disappeared. Some had found new paths, others had not. The economy had moved on, but it had not taken everyone with it. And so the question remained. Was balance restored? The answer, like most honest answers, depends on where you look. If you look at the numbers, the GDP, the employment rate, the strength of the banks, then the picture is bright. The Netherlands today is one of the world's most developed countries. Its public transport is smooth. Its cities are clean and safe. Its hospitals and schools are respected. Its people live long, stable lives. That is one kind of balance. But if you look at the map at the space between the wealth, the answer becomes more complex. Not every region recovered in the same way. Some towns once held up by industry still carry the quiet weight of loss. Some families still speak of work that was once passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, now replaced by something more distant, more digital, less known. And beneath the soil, the gas has slowed. Partly because the fields are no longer full, partly because the ground has begun to tremble. The small earthquakes in Groningen have shaken not just homes, but confidence. They remind the country that nothing taken from the earth is free, that the ground must be respected, not only used. In recent years, the government has promised to stop gas extraction in Groningen altogether. The decision came after long debate, long study, and long concern. It was not easy, because the gas still had value. But the people mattered more. That too is a kind of balance. Choosing people over profits, land over numbers, future over present. The Netherlands has also turned its eyes toward a different kind of energy. Not under the ground, but above it. Wind, Sunday water, clean energy, built not on what is removed, but on what already flows. This new direction is slow. It requires learning. It does not offer the same quick profits that gas once did, but it offers something else. A way forward that does not lean too hard in any one place. A way forward that remembers the lesson taught by gas and tries to walk a steadier path. In classrooms, students learn now not only about natural resources, but about sustainability, about balance, about history. In government buildings, policy is shaped with more awareness of long-term consequences. In town halls, residents speak more often about what kind of future they want to build, not only for their families, but for the land itself. And in quiet corners of the country, older people sit in cafes or parks remembering how things once were. Some miss the old days. Some admire the change. Most carry both thoughts together. Because that is what balance really means. It is not about going back. It is not about erasing the past. It is about knowing where you came from and choosing again and again how to move forward. The Dutch disease was never just about gas. It was about choices and about listening to what happens when the ground gives too much and the rest is left behind. The question of balance is not one that is answered once and forever. It is asked again in each budget, in each law, in each generation. And the Netherlands, like any country, continues to ask it. Has the balance been restored? Perhaps not fully, but it has been felt. And in that feeling there is hope. The hope that next time the steps will be softer, the decisions more shared, the future more evenly carried. That is the quiet success of the Dutch story. Not that they avoided the fall, but that they saw it coming, felt it, learned from it, and began slowly, gently to stand again. Part 14. The disease that taught a lesson. Sometimes the greatest lessons come not from loud mistakes, but from quiet consequences. The Netherlands never planned to teach the world a lesson. It never asked to become a case study or a warning. But the way its economy changed after discovering natural gas created something that others could see. And in time, they did. Economists gave it a name: the Dutch disease. A simple phrase, easy to remember. But behind it stood years of slow change. Factories that grew still, jobs that faded, a currency that grew too strong, an economy that leaned too far on one gift, and in doing so, lost others. And when the name caught on, first in academic papers, then in newspapers, then in conversations among world leaders, it brought with it a deeper understanding that natural wealth, while powerful, does not always help in the way people hope. That a country can grow richer and weaker at the same time. That good fortune can still bring imbalance if it is not carefully shaped. The Dutch story was not dramatic. It was not built on sudden collapse or political chaos, but that's what made it powerful. It showed that even in a strong country, even with good leadership and smart people, even with trust and peace, this pattern could still unfold. And if it could happen in the Netherlands, it could happen anywhere. That idea traveled. It moved across borders. It entered boardrooms, universities, and ministries in countries where oil, gas, copper, or diamonds had just been found. In those places, leaders stood at the edge of new wealth. They saw the promise. They heard the excitement. And sometimes they paused. Not all of them, not always, but in more and more places, the Dutch example was discussed. It became a way to explain something hard to see: the long, quiet shift that happens when one part of the economy grows too fast and leaves the rest behind. In Australia, when mineral exports surged in the early 2000s, some economists warned of Dutch disease. They saw the currency rise. They saw manufacturing slow, and they used the Dutch case as a mirror. In Canada, as oil sands production grew, the government faced similar questions. Could they grow energy without losing other industries? Could they balance wealth with sustainability? In Brazil, in Kazakhstan, in Angola, in the United Arab Emirates, the phrase returned again and again, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a guide, sometimes as both. And slowly, the world began to look differently at natural wealth. It was no longer just a gift. It was a test of planning, a test of patience, a test of values. The Dutch, for their part, did not push their story forward. They did not claim to have all the answers, but they shared what they had learned. They offered knowledge. They spoke at global conferences. They sent experts to help other nations build stronger systems. And in doing so, they turned their quiet struggle into something meaningful, a lesson not of failure, but of recovery. Because the Dutch disease is not only about what goes wrong, it is about what happens next. And in that next part, the part where a country adjusts, reflects, and repairs, there is something powerful. It shows that balance can be rebuilt, that choices can shift, that a future shaped by natural wealth can still be stable if it is built with care. In classrooms around the world, students now study the Dutch experience. They read about how gas changed the economy. They learn how the guilder became too strong. They follow the decline of industry and the slow return of new sectors. They see the patterns, and they ask new questions. How can we do better? What can we save before it's lost? How do we share wealth without weakening what holds us up? These are not simple questions, but they are important. And they exist in part because the Netherlands lived through the first version of the story. It gave the world a way to see something before it happened. A soft warning, a quiet voice saying, "Be careful," even when things look good. That voice has helped. In some countries, steps were taken early. Funds were created. Budgets were balanced. Industries were supported before they slipped. In others, the lesson came too late. The pattern repeated. The currency rose. Jobs disappeared. Growth turned to dependence. But even there, the Dutch story remained close. As a tool, as a guide, as a reminder. Because what the Netherlands experienced was not just a national moment. It became a global memory. And like any good memory, it stays with us, not to bring pain, but to protect us. To help us see more clearly next time. To help us walk more steadily when new wealth arrives. That is the quiet strength of the lesson. It teaches without shouting. It leads without pride. It simply shows the way, through its own steps, its own turns, its own recovery. And in doing so, it offers hope. That even when imbalance begins, even when things lean too far, there is still time to listen, to learn, to change, and to find again a steady path forward. Part 15. Whispers Beneath the Soil. Beneath the green fields of Groningen, deep under the towns and farms, the gas still rests. Not as much as before and not as powerful as it once seemed. But it is there, silent, waiting. A quiet memory held in stone and pressure. It is strange to think that so much began in such a still place. Groningen is not a loud land. It is flat and wide. Its skies are open. Its roads are straight. Its houses are simple and kind. For centuries, people lived here by the rhythm of the seasons. Wind pushed across the plains. Cows grazed, wheat grew, and people worked with care, shaping their lives with patience and quiet pride. Then, in 1959, the whisper came. Not a roar, not a crash, just a whisper from the soil. Gas had been found. At first, no one knew what it would mean. It was news, of course. It was exciting. But it was only later, as the years unfolded, that the full weight of it became clear. The gas brought money, the money brought change, and the change brought both comfort and confusion. Over time, the land changed too. Not on the surface, not at first, but slowly, gently, it began to speak again. The tremors started small, barely noticeable. Then they grew stronger. Cracks formed in walls. Roofs shifted. Families grew uneasy. It was not the gas itself that shook the earth. It was what had been taken from beneath. And with every shake, the land seemed to say, "Remember. Remember what was here. Remember what was done. Remember that the ground has a voice too." The people listened. The government listened. And change followed. Extraction slowed. Safety funds were created. New rules were written. But the whispers remained, not angry, just steady, like the wind through the grass, like the water in the canals, like memory itself. In many ways, this is how the story ends. Not with a final answer, but with a feeling. The Netherlands still stands tall. Its cities are clean. Its people are thoughtful. Its systems are admired around the world. But beneath the success, there is something more. A deep awareness of balance, of limits, of choices made. This awareness does not shout. It does not point fingers. It simply waits. It teaches quietly. It says wealth is a gift, but it is not everything. It says the earth can give, but it can also remind. It says when one part of life grows too fast, others can fade. And we must pay attention. The Dutch people carry this lesson with grace. They do not dwell on the past, but they do not forget it either. In Groningen, the government is now working to close the gas fields. The wells will be sealed. The land will be repaired. Homes will be strengthened. And slowly, the shaking will stop. But the story will stay. It will be told in schools. It will be studied in universities. It will be whispered in offices where energy decisions are made. It will live not just in books or laws, but in the shape of the future. Because once you have seen what imbalance can do, gently, slowly, over time, you begin to build differently. You begin to walk more carefully. You begin to ask not just how much can be taken, but what must be protected. This is the real ending of the Dutch disease. Not a sickness, not a curse, but a message, a warning wrapped in wealth, a lesson shaped by quiet change. Other countries will face the same test. Some already have. Some will soon. They will find oil, or gas, or gold. They will feel the pull of sudden fortune. And when they do, they may remember the Netherlands. They may remember the story of the gas that gave too much. They may remember the factories that fell silent, the currency that rose too far, the earth that shook in reply. And with that memory, they may choose differently. They may balance better. They may plan ahead. They may ask the questions early. What will this mean? Who will it help? Who will it leave behind? What will we do when the resource runs dry? These are not easy questions, but they are honest. And in the honesty, there is strength. The Dutch were not perfect. No one is. But they faced their moment with care. They made changes. They learned. They shared. And in doing so, they left behind something greater than wealth. They left behind wisdom. A kind of soft compass, pointing not north or south, but toward balance. Toward steady ground. Toward futures built not on chance, but on choice. And so the whisper beneath the soil continues. Not as warning, not as grief, but as a gentle voice, reminding us of what matters most, that people are stronger than profits, that land is more than resource, that comfort must be shared to last, and that when we walk forward, we do so not alone, but with the memory of those who walked before, who learned, who listened, and who passed on their quiet truth.